The trailer came down the mountain road at 7 in the morning on a cold, rain-slick November Thursday, and Clara Vance was already at the gate when it turned in. She had been up since 4, not because the horses required her to be up at 4 since they were not yet her horses, but because she was the kind of person who preferred to face the dark before the dark brought her something she had to handle. The trailer was rusted, the paint peeling in long, jagged strips that showed the oxidized iron underneath, the unmistakable mark of a livestock haul that had seen too many final trips to the slaughterhouse yard. It was a small load this morning, just 7 horses, mixed breeds, mostly draft crosses and older quarter horses, their heads low, their coats matted with wet straw and manure. But it wasn't their weight or their winter coats that made them a matching set. It was the left side of their faces. Every single one of them was blind in one eye. Her neighbor, a man named Silas Thorne, who ran a premier breeding operation of registered quarter horses 3 miles down the valley, and who had been watching from his idling truck in the way that ranchers in Logan County watched anything that disrupted the visual baseline of the road, pulled onto the gravel shoulder. He rolled his window down, letting out the smell of hot gas and cheap convenience store coffee. He looked at the trailer, then at Clara's muddy boots. "What in the world are you going to do with 7 one-eyed killers, Clara?" Silas said, his voice carrying the dry, heavy weight of a man who didn't believe in sentimentality unless it had a pedigree attached to it. Clara didn't look up from the gate latch. She said, "I'm giving them a place to stand." Silas looked at her, his eyes narrowing in the specific way of a man who calculated profit per acre and found her answer to be a form of financial delinquency. "You paid slaughter price for 7 animals that can't see a fence line on their left side. They'll panic, they'll break their legs in the draws, and you'll be buried in vet bills before the first hard freeze." She said, "They've already survived the worst thing that could happen to them, Silas. A fence line isn't going to scare them." He shook his head, shifted his truck back into drive, and spat out the window. "Thanksgiving is 3 weeks away. Don't come looking for my tractor when you need to bury them." He drove on, his tires kicking up gray mountain mud. Clara went to help the driver drop the ramp. "Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin." The Vance Ranch was 160 acres of high, broken timber and steep shale ridges in the northern corner of Logan County, West Virginia. The kind of land that had been logged out in the 1950s and left to grow back into scrub oak, wild blackberry, and deep, treacherous limestone ravines that the locals called the Blind Draws. Clara's grandfather, Arthur Vance, had bought the property in 1952 with money he'd made hauling timber, and he had spent 40 years trying to raise cattle on ground that preferred to raise rocks. Arthur had died in 2012. Clara's father had sold off the remaining stock and left the land static until his own passing 2 years ago. Clara had come back from her position as a backcountry search and rescue medic in the Pacific Northwest because the house was empty, the taxes were due, and the mountains were the only place where the silence didn't feel like an omission. She was 38 when she came back, and she was now 40, which was enough time to have cleared the fallen timber from the main trails, but not enough time to have forgotten how quickly the high ridges could turn against a person. The flat pasture near the road was only 20 acres, and it was decent orchard grass. But the remaining 140 acres rose sharply into the mountain, a vertical maze of loose slate, narrow ledges, and steep drop-offs, where the mountain road wound up toward the high ridge timber camps and the isolated settlement at Eagle Crest. Her father had called the upper sections the high shelf. His father had called it the goat track. It was the kind of ground where a normal horse, trained on flat arena sand, would look down, lose its depth perception, and freeze in terror. The high shelf was where the 7 one-eyed horses would live. She had found them at a low-end livestock auction in Ohio, a place where animals were sold by the pound rather than the hand. They were a lot that had been rejected by a local riding stable after a severe outbreak of equine influenza had left several horses with corneal scarring and permanent blindness in their left eyes. The owner didn't want the liability of trail horses that had a permanent blind spot. To the slaughter buyers, they were just meat weight. But Clara had spent a decade watching how animals navigated terrain when they were missing a sense. She stood in the auction alley and watched the 7 horses move. They didn't crowd each other. When they turned in a tight, coordinated wheel, using their good right eyes to track each other's flanks, their ears moving like radar dishes to compensate for the dark side. She bought the lot for an animal, using the last of her saving grant from the rescue service. She called a local transport company, lined the floor of her grandfather's old timber barn with fresh cedar shavings, and waited. The first 3 weeks were an exercise in recalibration. Clara went through the herd systematically, treating the lingering respiratory infections and cleaning the neglected hooves. She identified each one in her grandfather's old leather-bound ledger. There was Jack, a heavy-boned Percheron crossed with a massive chest and a missing left eye. Bess, an older dun mare with deep scarring over her socket, and 5 others that carried themselves with the quiet, watchful patience of animals that had learned to live in a half-seen world. The farm vet, Dr. Marcus Vance, no relation, though his family had lived in the valley as long as hers, came on the second Sunday. He spent 3 hours checking their hearts and assessing their vision. At the end of it, he sat on an overturned crate and watched the horses pick through the cedar shavings. "Their right eyes are perfectly sharp," Marcus said, packing his stethoscope. "But you know the rule with one-eyed horses, Clara. If you approach them on the left without talking, they'll jump out of their skin. If you take them onto a narrow trail with a drop-off on their blind side, they'll lean into the mountain until they slip." Clara said, "What if you don't fight the lean? What if you let them use the mountain as a guide?" Marcus looked at her, his face lined with the memory of 30 years of mountain veterinary work. "Your grandfather tried to break a blind mule back in '78. He said the animal knew more about the edge of a cliff than he did because it didn't trust what it couldn't see. It trusted its feet instead. But a horse isn't a mule, Clara. A horse panics when it gets confused." She said, "I'm not confusing them. I'm letting them map the ground." She opened the upper pasture gate the next morning. She didn't ride them. She walked on foot, leading Jack by a long lead line, allowing him to track her voice. The other 6 followed in a single file line, their good right eyes turned toward the rising rock face of the mountain, their left sides facing the open valley below. Clara observed them daily and wrote in her ledger, Week 3, left eye blind herd introduced to the high shelf trails. Normal horses track the horizon and spook at distant movement. This herd tracks the immediate vertical surface on their right. They use their hooves to gauge the density of the shale rather than looking at the drop. Jack behaves as the anchor. Bess tracks his sound. By mid-November, the weather broke into a historic cold rain that turned the clay soil of the valley into a heavy liquid grease. For 4 days, the sky was the color of wet iron, and the runoff from the high ridges transformed the shallow creeks into roaring brown torrents. On Tuesday night, the mountain gave way. A section of the upper cliff face, destabilized by years of old timber cuts and saturated by 72 hours of continuous downpour, collapsed. 10,000 tons of mud, shale, and uprooted hemlock slid across the county road at the narrow pass known as the Throat, burying 200 yards of asphalt under 15 feet of unstable debris. The slide completely isolated the high ridge community of Eagle Crest, including the Mountain Elementary School, where 12 children and 2 teachers were staying for an overnight nature retreat. The power lines went down at 3 in the morning. By 6, the valley was filled with the flashing red lights of the county emergency vehicles. Clara walked down to the roadblock at the Throat. The scene was chaotic. The mud was still moving, a slow, viscous river of gray clay that swallowed the tires of the county's heaviest backhoes. A rescue helicopter from the state capitol had tried to lift off. But the high ridge was choked with a thick, freezing mountain fog that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet, rendering an aerial evacuation impossible. Silas Thorne was there, standing next to his large horse trailer, surrounded by 3 of his top trail guides and his prized registered quarter horses. He had volunteer emergency vests buckled over his canvas coat. "We can't get the machines through," Silas was shouting to the county sheriff. "The mud is too deep for the trucks. And the old logging path around the back of the ridge is only 18 inches wide in the shale sections. I tried to lead my stallion up the lower loop, but he took one look at the washout on his left and nearly went over the side. He won't go near it. No horse will. They can't find their footing with the drop-off right there in the fog." Clara stepped through the crowd of orange-vested volunteers. She said, "My horses will go." Silas turned, his face red from the cold and the frustration. "Clara, this isn't the time for your rescue fantasy. Your horses are half blind. If my best cattle horses, animals with perfect vision and standard training, won't face that ledge in the fog, your killers will fall into the canyon before you hit the first switchback." "Your horses are looking at the fog, Silas," Clara said quietly. "They're looking at the empty space where the road used to be, and they're panicking because they can't see the bottom. My horses don't care about the empty space. They only look at what's solid." The sheriff, a man who had known Clara's grandfather and had seen her record with the search and rescue teams out west, looked at her for a long 3 seconds. He said, "How much weight can they pack, Clara?" "Jack can handle 200 pounds of medical supplies and blankets. The others can take the children down 2 at a time if we walk them in a pack," she said. Silas stepped in front of her. "It's suicide. If one slips, they all go." "Then don't look," Clara said. She went back to the barn, saddled Jack with the heavy canvas pack panniers, and put simple halters on Bess and the other 5. She didn't use blinkers. She didn't try to hide their blind sides. She packed 40 pounds of emergency rations, thermal blankets, and insulin for one of the trapped children into the bags. They started up the old logging path at 7:30 a.m. The fog was so thick it felt like walking through wet wool. The trail was a narrow ribbon of loose slate clinging to the vertical rock wall of the ridge. To the left, the mountain dropped 500 feet into the rocky bed of Cutter Creek. Clara walked at Jack's head, her left hand on his halter, her right hand guiding him toward the inside wall. She didn't ride. She spoke in a low, rhythmic monotone, the same search and rescue cadence she had used in the mountain passes of Oregon. "Step, Jack. Easy now. Good boy. Hold the wall." What happened on that ledge was something Silas Thorne could never have understood. A normal horse would have turned its head left to look at the terrifying void of the canyon, seen the shifting shale sliding into the fog, and bolted or reared. But the 7 horses had their blind left eyes turned toward the abyss. To them, the left side wasn't a terrifying drop-off. It was simply the quiet dark they lived with every single day. Their good right eyes were fixed entirely on the solid, unchanging limestone face of the mountain on their right. They tracked the vertical rock line like a rail. Jack moved with a slow, deliberate stomp, his heavy Percheron hooves testing the stability of the slate before he committed his weight. Bess followed 3 feet behind his tail, her right eye locked on Jack's hock, her left ear turned toward the sound of Clara's voice. The remaining 5 horses formed a perfect, unhurried chain, their bodies leaning slightly into the mountain wall, using the solid stone as a physical baseline. They didn't look down because they couldn't. They didn't panic at the fog because their world was already bounded by what was within reach. It took them 2 hours to climb the 3 miles of the washout trail. When they cleared the tree line at the top of Eagle Crest, the logging camp workers and the 2 school teachers were standing near the cabins, their faces white from the cold and the dark. The children were huddled inside the main lodge around a dying wood stove. Clara didn't waste time. She unpacked the insulin, distributed the blankets, and loaded the 12 children onto the 7 horses. She buckled the smaller ones into the pack panniers on Jack's sides, balanced by the weight of the blankets. The older children rode bareback on Bess and the mares, their small hands gripping the thick winter manes. "Keep your legs tucked in tight against the mountainside," Clara told the children. "Don't look at the fog. Just look at the horses' ears." The descent was slower. The rain had turned to a light, freezing sleet, and the shale was clicking under the horses' iron shoes like broken glass. But the herd didn't hesitate. They had traveled the high shelf for 3 weeks under Clara's quiet direction, and the path was already marked in their physical memory. They moved down the mountain in the same single file line, their blind sides to the void, their good eyes to the stone. At 1:15 in the afternoon, the crowd at the roadblock went completely silent. Through the gray curtain of the mountain fog, the massive shape of Jack appeared, his chest covered in frozen mud, his panniers carrying 4 sleeping children. Behind him came Bess, then the rest of the herd, every child safe, every horse moving with the same unhurried, rhythmic stomp that they had used when they stepped off the Slaughterhouse trailer 3 weeks prior. The emergency workers rushed forward with dry blankets and hot thermoses. The parents climbed over the mud barrier to pull their children from the saddles. Clara led the horses past the ambulances and toward her trailer. Silas Thorne was standing by his truck, his expensive quarter horses, still blanketed inside their pristine aluminum bays, untouched and useless in the face of the mountain's reality. He watched Clara unbuckle Jack's cinch. He looked at the horse's scarred, empty left eye socket, which was wet with sleet and gray mud. He walked over slowly, his hands deep in his pockets, his boots sinking 3 inches into the valley clay. He stood there for a long time before he spoke. "The sheriff said the outer ledge had caved in down to 14 inches near the second turn," Silas said, his voice flat, stripped of its usual arrogance. "My stallion would have broken his back trying to turn around on that." Clara wiped the mud from Jack's nose with the sleeve of her coat. "Your stallion is a beautiful animal, Silas, but he needs a perfect world to be useful. These horses have already survived the end of the world. They don't need it to be perfect." Silas looked at the horses picking at the dry hay in her trailer. He nodded once, a sharp, reluctant drop of his chin. I've got 20 tons of clean alfalfa sitting in my lower barn, Clara. It's been stored dry since August. I'll have my boy haul it over to your barn this evening. No charge. Not this month and not this winter. She looked at him and said, "They'll eat it." He turned and walked back to his truck without another word. Clara registered the Vance Ranch as a permanent equine rehabilitation sanctuary with the State Land Preservation Board in December. The registration didn't bring in any state funding, but it changed the status of the high shelf in the county deed records. It was no longer listed as marginally productive scrubland. It was documented as the Vance Mountain Refuge. She sat at the kitchen table on an evening in late December. Her grandfather's ledger opened under the yellow light of the lamp. The valley was quiet under a fresh blanket of hard snow. She turned to the last page she had written and added the final entry for the year, December 28. Herd wintering well on the high pasture. Silas's alfalfa holding out. Jack's left socket clean and healed. Bess showing zero signs of trail stress. 12 children from the Ridge camp came back on Saturday to bring carrots. The land holds what people forget. Sometimes it takes a broken animal to show you that the broken places are the only ones worth walking. She closed the ledger and placed it back on the shelf next to her grandfather's timber logs from 1952. The place where the stories were kept for whoever had to face the dark next. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told that what they have or who they are isn't worth the trouble because of a limitation. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever seen an animal find a way through a place where everyone else froze, I want to hear your story in the comments.